No questions. Okay. And if you haven't already done so, please do make sure you put your name in the chat so I can make sure I get your attendance updated as well over the next few days. So get all that done for you. All right. So the last part on adolescence, and it kind of goes with some of the conversation we saw in the video about communication with adolescents, is social development and emotional development. Okay. As you probably saw with all of our developmental elements, adolescent social world changes very quickly. We go from, a dependent type basis with our family to an individual basis, more with our peers and our friends outside of the family unit, usually, not always. And this really reflects these biological and cognitive developmental changes that we've been talking about. We have the going again from a child body to an adult body, and cognitively, we're starting to think beyond ourself and thinking more about what impact do I want to have on this world? How do I become successful in preparing again? This change in cognitive development is in response to the reality that we're becoming biological adults, and someday we're going to need to take over ownership of who we are. Okay. So you probably could guess that gender and sexual development are important during these stages, as the person mentioned on Tuesday about communication with adolescents, that this becomes a period where questions of gender and sexual development come to fruition. And this is where we're also going to solidify our things like gender identity and our sexual identity as an individual. Now, but I want to make it clear, life is not just that simple. These things can change over the lifespan. But this is where we kind of really have a little bit more concrete idea of who we are, gender and sexually wise. Okay. And this means that this becomes a more central importance. Okay. And so kind of looking at it from this perspective, so during childhood, cross-sex interests are tolerated to some extent. Okay. What we mean by cross-sex interests is early in childhood, for example, it's okay for little boys to play with teddy bears, to some extent to even play with dolls. And little girls are able to play with little trucks and cars and those more boy-oriented toys, and those behaviors are tolerated to a certain extent. Okay, but in adolescence, parents and peers tend to provide a stronger message about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior for a boy versus a girl. Okay, I remember very clear. This is my example of this. When I was a child, um, me and my parents were very affectionate with each other. We'd hold hands, we'd put our arms around each other in public. We wouldn't be afraid to show any type of affection in a public place. Okay. But I remember when I was about 12 years of age, I was walking down the mall with my dad, and I went and put my arm around him like I've done a million times before. And I remember him shrugging my arm off of him and saying, "Son, it's time that you learn that this isn't how two men walk in a public place." And he very much clearly created a boundary between him and me, because this is the way men interact, not a man and their kids. Okay, so that's probably my strongest example of how parents and peers tend to provide strong message. And I know when we talked about when we're in older childhood, it tends to be the opposite sex that tends to reinforce these behaviors more when it comes to peer pressure or peer influence. Okay. And then moving beyond that, a number of factors bear on a young people's sexual development during adolescence, such as increased hormonal levels are associated with heightened interest in sex in both boys and girls. So these are all things that we know have an influence on an adolescent's notion about not only who they are gender wise, but who they're sexually interested in as well. Okay. And there is no doubt that peers are very important to adolescents. Okay. During this phase of life, people spend an increasing amount of time in the companies of peers and increasing focus on peer relationships, crucial to their identity. So, earlier in the semester, we talked about attachment and attachment theory, and we said that early childhood attachment can be predictive of adult attachment styles. But I said, but that's only if you control for a moderator. Okay. What a moderator is in statistical terms is something that can change the direction of a relationship of something. Okay. So, for example, an example of a moderator is if you have a river and you put a dam there, the water will go a different direction, right? So, kind of an example of what we're talking about when we talk about moderating effects. Okay. We find that the attachment that a adolescent has with their peers can moderate that relationship. So if they stay, let's say that you have a healthy attachment style and you maintain that healthy attachment style in adolescence, then that early childhood adolescence attachment will predict your adult attachment. But let's say you get into adolescence, and because of some changes in your life, friendships change and everything else, you get into where you're developing an insecure attachment with your peers and your friends. Okay. It'll actually be that change in that peer attachment that will be more predictive of your adult attachment style. Okay. So this is with a complication of saying attachment in early childhood totally predicts adult. There's a lot of moderating effects, and this happens to be one of them, is the importance of peers during adolescence. And of course, if you've lived in a rural place, in a rural area, your siblings and your cousins can be part of this peer relationship. So that's important to kind of keep in mind, especially when we get into more rural areas where families tend to be our peers and not necessarily some other child. Okay. Adolescents choose friends and they themselves report that, although they are subjected to peer pressure sometimes. They do not generally experience this as a major influence on their behavior or something that they find particularly difficult to handle. Okay. So, what current research is showing, and again, it's mainly relying on survey methods and those types of things. So, it's kind of hard to tie out exactly what's going on. But what we are finding is that unlike past hypotheses or assumptions, that teens have huge peer influences and peer pressure to, for example, drink or use drugs or to influence their sexual behaviors, as an example. Or even on a positive end, to be good in their sports or good academically. Okay. That really adolescents don't feel that that is a major factor in why they behave the way they behave, that they choose to behave in the manner and with the individuals that looks like there's a lot of peer pressure that's peer pressuring them into behaving a certain way. So the old model that suggested that adolescents were hugely influenced by peer pressure is being challenged currently. And we're actually showing that there's more of a self-directed model that we should look at. And in essence, if we want to summarize this as a parental warning, if our child enters into substance abuse because you notice they started hanging out with Billy, who you see as a negative influence, he probably picked Billy before he picked drinking, but Billy had nothing to do with him making the decision to drink or her the decision to drink. Okay. So these kind of factors keep in mind. Now, there are areas of life where this isn't challenged. Okay, so the what we can exclude as far as peer pressure would be things like dating violence. Okay, where a girl or a boy is forced into some type of behavior that they would not do independent of that individual's pressure. Okay, so there are situations, for example, in romantic relationships where peer pressure can play a large role in it. However, even though as adults we think we're more independent, we see a lot of adult victims of domestic violence and relationship violence engaging in those behaviors because of the pressure of their partner. So we've got to be careful of saying this is only an issue with adolescents. We will see this is going to be an issue when we get into young adulthood and into adulthood as we start developing family systems. So what current research is suggesting is rather than peers providing an antithesis of parental influences, research suggests that relationship is much more complex. For example, in early adolescence, some adolescent behaviors, such as drug use, tend to show greater association with parental than peer practices. So in early adolescence, adolescent tends to model what they see in their parents. Okay. Whereas with older adolescents, perceive peer influence in matters of drug use as greater than the parental influence. So there's a change. So even those habitual drug uses start in early childhood by modeling what they're seeing with their parents rather than their peers. When they get into older adolescence, they have a cognitive shift to saying, well, it's I drink because of my peers, for example. Okay. Because of that need for independence and independent identity from parents, as we see through adolescence. Okay. Now, this is, again, I just want to put this is general trends. Okay. We definitely know that there are some adolescents who parents were model health citizens, and they can add with an adolescent who ends up getting into drug use and substance use. But those are what we call outliers. They tend not to represent the more general population of why adolescents use. Now, evidence suggests that adolescents' choice of peers is itself influenced by the parents. And so this is another important kind of challenge to traditional thoughts about using peers as antithesis to parents, is that parents encourage and discourage particular friendships. So peers are important, but not omnipotent. Okay. Um, all right. So now what we want to do is kind of transition from conversations dealing with adolescence. So we talked about here we have, if you want to think about getting near the end of adolescence, we have all the raw ingredients necessary for an individual to start to care for themselves financially and housing wise. We're getting to a situation where an individual has the capacities and the abilities to get into intimate relationships and start developing families and having children of their own. We're getting to the kind of that success driven period of life. And this is where we're going to start seeing the transition between adolescence and early adulthood. Okay. And as we start to get into this early, middle, and late adulthood period, these age periods are kind of arbitrary, but you'll notice that they're much more broad than when we were talking about early childhood, um, um, middle childhood, early adolescence, late adolescence, and those. I mean, we're talking a time period of 18 years where there's like 4 or 5 unique different stages that we can talk about. Okay. The argument is that in when we get into adulthood, life is becoming more and more complex, and time demands become more and more complex. And so, developing in short periods of time doesn't really make sense as we get into the adult years. Okay. So, when we talk about early, middle, and late adult years, I do want to just say that in the literature right now, as we see it, early adulthood is being seen as more around the age of about 22 to about the age of 40. Okay, so that really hasn't changed. There is some debate that maybe early adulthood should go to 45, but most of the literature puts middle adulthood at that 41 to about 65 years of age. And then there is a real debate about this late adulthood. There's some debates that this should be divided into 3 unique categories, or there's been some argument that middle adulthood should be extended from about 65 to about 73, and then we enter late adulthood. But we'll get into the arguments of why that might be when we get to do those unique age groups. Okay. Um, And I just want to make a note on this one right here. It's difficult to determine precisely when adolescence begins and ends, and determining exactly when adulthood commences and proves to be elusive. Okay, so at the beginning of these lectures, going into adolescence and adulthood, I mentioned that here in the United States, puberty is getting younger and younger and younger, and maturation is getting older and older. And I mentioned, the onset of menstruation in girls we've seen as young as the age of 4. Um, and we see that, for example, psychological maturation, basically the understanding that I need to take care of my life responsibilities before I give in to things that bring pleasure, the t-shirt example, or the ability to uh, pay your bills, take care of yourself. If you have family, take care of family. Those kinds of things tend to be around about the age of 27. And then I mentioned that there's a gender split in this. Well, so those are general trends we see, but we can also see that culture plays a role. Whether you live in an urban place or a rural place plays a role. Parental involvement plays a role. And so answering the questions based on these general findings is really difficult to do. Okay. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we talk about these different ages, and we're getting from adolescence into adulthood. Early adulthood, we should say for the most part, is the time for our peak physical capacity. Believe it, our body reaches our full height by late teens, but our physical strength increases in the late 20s and early 30s. So we're actually most physically strong starting at around the age of about 27 up to about the age of 35, which is counter to the belief that much earlier adults in their early 20s and teens tend to be stronger, but actual physical strength is at its peak around about the age of 27 to 35. Manual agility and coordination, such as sensory capacity, such as vision and hearing, are also at their peak during this later 20s into the 30s periods, up to about the age of 40, is when we see our vision and our hearing at their best. Okay. And our ability to be mobile, I should say that as well. Okay. But change is imminent. And I think this is where we start talking about the transition from early adulthood into middle adulthood. Because some basic abilities do decline. So, for example, perception of high pitched tones is found in late 20s, but by about the mid 30s, we tend to start to lose the ability to hear high pitched noises. Hence, hearing an infant cry is much more noxious to a person in their late 30s and 40s than when we were in our earlier years. Okay. But on the most part, we do need to note that early adults feel very robust and energetic as a group in a whole, as a whole. On the other hand, in this group are also legally able to do things like damaging substance, such as alcohol and tobacco abuse. Many can access illegal stimulants at this period of time, and young adults have an increased responsibility of organizing their own eating habits and exercise regimen. So this is where we do find a huge influence on how a young adult was raised through their adolescence, if they were encouraged to eat right, encouraged to exercise, encouraged to have moderation. This is where we see those peak performance. When alcohol and tobacco are introduced in adolescence, they're more likely to be increased in consumption into early adulthood. Okay. So, not surprisingly, the health status and prospects of young adults are dependent more than ever before on our behavioral choices, not necessarily where we are in our developmental period. Okay. 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 So, what we've done for today is I'm going to stop our sharing for today. Stop.